I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to throw this out there. I have a channel over on YouTube, Life as a ... which basically hosts highlights from these audio conversations that I have with these great guests. They typically run 10 to 15 minutes, and they're there to kind of present a different vantage point. You know, for people that aren't into audio, aren't into podcasts, but are still looking for career advice, ideas, help, all that great stuff, send them over to YouTube. Like I said, Life as a ... And if you do get over there, I would love that like or subscribe. I mean, it's the best way to let that algorithm know that the content is worth sharing and should be out there. So anyway, I do thank you for letting me plug this a little bit, but I think it's about time to get into today's episode. Let's face it, part of the process in finding your professional calling is really all about getting in touch with yourself. Like, what drives you at a granular level? Are you someone who loves building things, strategizing, working independently, or working with others? There are about 1 billion questions to ask yourself to kind of get at all of this, but I think you get my point. In essence, what it really comes down to is what gets your juices flowing. Well, on today's show, I discovered someone that I could not imagine doing anything different, and I'm pretty certain she feels the same. You see, she's one of those professionals who truly nailed her professional occupational choice, and she's here to share all about how her career unfolded. And in the process, those who have an interest in the world of all-around communications, such as print and broadcast journalism, stand to benefit in a major way. Our guest's experiences include just about everything under this banner of communications. However, I might add her work has been and continues to be executed at the highest level all across the globe. So as for next steps, well, give me a second to more formally introduce her to you, and we can get this conversation started. Charlotte Kahn is an all-around communications expert who is not only passionate and multi-skilled, but holds over 20 years of experience as a print and broadcast journalist, working for some of the world's leading media organizations like Bloomberg TV, Standard & Poor's, Euronews, M6, RTL, Zaya, Thomson Reuters, and others. And she's recorded hundreds of interviews with top CEOs, business executives, politicians, thought leaders, influencers, scientists, and many others. Now, Charlotte regularly coaches CEOs, CFOs, and executives of listed and private companies, entrepreneurs, ambassadors, and diplomatic staff and politicians. And in parallel, she offers editorial services like strategy and writing to large corporates and organizations, mostly thought leadership relating to multimedia brand content. And in being a bilingual, English and French, and socio-culturally agile professional, she's at her happiest in a fast-paced environment dealing with a variety of challenges. And further, Charlotte is a highly respected international master of ceremonies moderator and interviewer. A sampling of guests she's held stage with include Al Gore, Michael Barnier, Bill Browder, and the CEOs of Moderna, Accor, JCDecaux, French ministers, and leading global economists. Now, finally, Charlotte is president of Humanity Diaspo, a Paris-based humanitarian aid, femtech, and female empowerment NGO with a global reach, and an ambassador for the Zayed Sustainability Prize, the UAE's pioneering global award that recognizes and rewards SMEs, nonprofit organizations, and global high schools with sustainable and humanitarian solutions. So with all of this noted, I'd like to welcome you to my conversation with Charlotte Kahn. Yeah, so welcome to the program. How are you doing today, Charlotte?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, I am really thankful for, you taking some time and joining the program here. Been excited for this conversation. Your background kind of speaks for itself. And I'm sure listeners are quite keen to learn more about your career and all that you've been part of. So I do have this first segment lined up. And as my listeners know, it's something called Coloring Wikipedia. And it's just a segment where I read off a definition of something that relates to what the guest does. And I went with communicative competence for you. Okay, so I'm just going to read this off. This is coming from Wikipedia, and then perhaps you could share your comments. Sound okay?
Sounds very good. I love the sound of it.
All right. Communicative competence. Yeah, here we go. So, communicative competence is the ability to communicate effectively or to choose the appropriate communicative behavior in a given situation. It concerns what to say, when to say it, and how to say it. It further includes the ability to receive and understand messages. Now, we're not introducing any new ideas here, obviously, but the reason I bring it up, and I think it's interesting in the sense like as professionals, we put our own stamp on the work that we do. And based off of, again, all of your experiences, high level experiences, I might add, I'd love to get your take on that and what it personally means to you.
I think you're very much spot on here, Christopher. You've mentioned listening. That's the second part, but it's a very important part indeed. Having empathy and being interested in people and their stories. It's at the heart of what I do. And it's always driven me personally to, like I've said, my job as an MC, as a journalist, as a moderator is not just to tell stories, but people's stories. Okay. So you have to pay attention to not just what they say, but the way they look, how they behave, their body language. So I'm always looking for subtle clues to understand their state of mind, where they come from a psychological place, what they like, dislike, and yeah, asking lots of questions. So if you want stories, yes, you need to dig a little bit deeper and find out more about what makes people tick. And you can do that very quickly. I'll share some clues later on. But in terms of saying the right thing at the right time, that's also very spot on, because I think that to be a good communicator, you need to be very much in the present. In fact, I'd like to think I've developed this concept of impact or conscious communication, where you engage people at a different level, at the level of the here and now. I think that's very important. So thank you very much for starting this conversation with this definition, which, as far as I'm concerned, has really managed to encapsulate what I do and how I feel about my job.
Well, it's great. It's great to hear because sometimes these definitions from Wikipedia don't necessarily hit. And yeah, it's nice to hear that it's working this time. And also, I like that point of through this lens of communication, we're looking at it from so many different angles. Like you said, body language, how people are interacting in that sense. I've got a question for you in relating to that. Is that something that you gradually picked up over the course of, becoming a professional? Or were these things that like innately you were kind of clued in on at a younger age?
It's a very good question indeed. So I also work as a media coach, a media trainer. Often during my presentations, I will spend some time explaining that communication is mostly nonverbal.
Hmm.
Okay. Let's not forget we're animals. The fight and flight thing. Okay. So that's often something that will come across in your body language. So I would say that I have naturally high EQ, if I may. I'm someone who's very much attuned to emotions and communication, people and their moods, etc. I'm a very emotional person myself, and I've had to, but that's my personal family story, I guess. I'll explain why later. But I have then found it more increasingly interesting to, yes, pay attention to people's body language and their behavior generally. So if someone's aggressive, for instance, and starts tapping, the table with their fingernails and is very fidgety or moves a lot, that shows a great degree of discomfort, for instance. And someone aggressive, aggression normally comes from a place of fear.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Normally a feeling of inferiority of or imposter syndrome going on there. So I'd say that possibly because I've had imposter syndrome myself in my career, and it still comes back from time to time, but I've managed to beat it with various techniques and a lot of, what do you call it, cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness, etc. You can change that. But I've learned to detect it in other people, to make them feel more comfortable, and to also understand that I should not really take things too personally. That's another very important point. The body language, yes, of course, it's very important, but it's not complicated. It's not rocket science. When you walk on stage, within seconds, I'd say almost split seconds, people can tell whether you're nervous or not, depending on how you hold yourself. Okay. Are your shoulders, back? Are you facing the audience with confidence? Are you spreading out, literally owning the space around you? Or are you recoiling in your shell? like an animal. We need protection from all this, okay? We are wired as people to instinctively detect those signs of discomfort, of fear, of enjoyment, etc. But yes, I would say that with work, you learn to do it on a different level because you don't just pick up on those signs, you start analyzing them.
I don't mean to belabor this point, but I had recently, I had a journalist on, a broadcast journalist actually, within a completely different realm than yours. He's actually within motorsports. You might be familiar with him. He's from the UK, Will Buxton. He's the F1 digital presenter. But we were speaking about this point, and one of the things that he was saying was that yes, he does many of the things that that you're just describing when he's interacting with some of these drivers, before the race, after the race, so on and so forth. But then also at least his take on this is that he doesn't want to psychologically attempt to break them down because it's out of his realm. It's something that's, it's not like his proper training. So rather than do that, he just focuses on, like, within his realm, just the results, what he's seeing, in front of him, rather than trying to psychoanalyze. And I wonder if there is that sort of like that line or that sort of like that gray area, because exactly what you were saying makes complete sense. You have to be able to do that to a certain degree, but perhaps if you're going too far overboard, it could get you in trouble. I don't know. I'm an outsider, so I'd love to get your take on that.
I think it's a very personal thing, quite frankly. I like to win over people. And my objective is always to create, whether I'm moderating or doing an interview. So I've got several objectives, but one of them is definitely to turn it into an experience, a positive experience, to make sure it's enjoyable for people and for myself, very selfishly. And the other point is the fact that my mission is to make them feel comfortable enough that they are empowered to deliver their message, because that's your mission, okay? To get their message and to get a powerful message. So it turns into this impactful communication experience opportunity I am trying to create. And so, like I said, it's a process, and it's a conscious process as far as I'm concerned. So I will go beyond that. And it may be, and I'm sorry to say, because there may be an element of male versus female here. Okay. I think women revel in empathy and positivity rather than confrontation. If you see what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Those are good points.
It's cliche, I'm sorry, but I think there's definitely an element of that.
Yeah, no, I would think so too. I would agree with that as well. Yeah, no, I love this. I love all these insights right out of the gate here. Yeah.
And another thing I would say, I would actually add, is that being able to create that, being able to make people feel comfortable, authentic, empowered, is very empowering for me too. It gives me power.
Yeah. Yeah.
It makes me more credible. It makes me more sought after, because people will want to renew their experience.
Yeah.
It sounds very scheming, doesn't it?
No. Like, I love it. I think these are great insights.
It really is the product of a long reflection on what I do and what I try to do and achieve.
Yeah. I mean, it makes complete sense, exactly the way you just laid it out there. And I think these are the types of insights for anyone who's aspiring to get into the position that you're within right now or have been within. This is valuable. It's valuable insight. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And this might be an opportune time to learn a little bit more about your background. I mean, I certainly, related some of that, to listeners off the top when I was introducing you, but perhaps you could share a little bit more.
So I'm often asked to describe what I do, and I find it very difficult. And you're right, actually, not to start with the fact that I am a trained journalist, and it's been my trade for a very long time. I am a master of ceremonies. I'm a moderator. I moderate conversations, panels at fairly large international conferences. And I'm also a media coach, an editor, a writer, etc. So I'm a communication professional, and I have developed a set of skills that I can apply to many different segments of communication generally. I started my career in the city of London, and I was completely random, covering financial markets. Before starting, I had zero interest in the economy. I did not even know what a share was. Okay. I studied literature, English. So I'm French born and bred. I grew up in a small village in Brittany. I've always been drawn to words, to literature, to books, to stories, to people. I was a very chatty, lively child, according to my mother. But I've always been also very curious about the world. And growing up in a small community, and I was a latchkey kid, so there was not very much parental involvement or supervision, I guess. But there was a library, and the library in my small village. We're talking 650 people here, okay? A small place, and the only source of entertainment was the library. So I'd spent all my Wednesdays, because in France schools are off on Wednesdays, and at the weekend just reading, reading, and reading. And reading was escapism. And then there was the TV, of course, and then I discovered MTV and what I would call and what the French called the Anglo-Saxon world, I guess. And I was there again very attracted to that world. And remember at the time it was very exciting in the 90s. It was all about, about the digital economy taking off, grunge, subcultural movements like that, rave, whatever. So there was a lot going on. So it was like an explosion of culture, really. So I loved it. I was very much into literature, culture, music, etc. And that's what I studied at university, English and French, literature and language. And then I moved to the UK as a French assistant. That was part of my studies. And I met someone who's now my husband after a couple of weeks. And I decided to stay, but that was not the only reason. I loved it. I felt at home here in London. So then I decided to do a master's in international journalism, and I had to finance my studies. I had to support myself, always. So it was very important after I graduated to find a job very quickly. And I struggled a little bit. It was difficult to start a career in journalism when I was non-native, came from somewhere else, didn't have the right connections, because literally I arrived from absolutely nowhere, okay? I came from nowhere. But I found this ad in The Guardian. It said, wanted stock market reporter, bilingual French English. And out of desperation, I applied. And it was a job working for a large American company. And I will always remember that I went to the interview. I asked my husband and his friends, who for some of them worked in investment banking at the time, I asked them to brief me about, the economy and the stock market, what a share is, etc. But I was absolutely clueless. So anyway, I turned up at the interview, and the recruiter is Franco-British. I thought, oh, okay, that must be a sign, surely.
Mm-hmm.
And he looked at me and we had a chat. He looked at my CV and he said to me, I'd always remember that, Charlotte, you're quite quirky, aren't you? You're a woman. You've written your master's thesis about the history of metaphysical science fiction. You're French. I mean, obviously, you know nothing about finance, but hey, you know what? Oh, I like you. You get the job.
Wow.
And so that was a big gamble, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that's how I learned in 3 months what you spend 3 years learning at business school. So I remember a lot of my job consisted in writing headlines about upgrades and downgrades by investment firms and analysts on various stocks. I remember dreaming about Morgan Stanley downgrading AstraZeneca to I don't know, underweight or that kind of stuff. So and I remember dreaming about numbers as well, because I didn't know that word. It was all very new to me. So it was like this crash course in economics and finance. And but it was a lot of fun, because at the time in the early noughties, I think it was 2003 or 2002, the city was very much alive. Yes, there'd been the dot-com, busts, but there was a lot of money. Obviously, we didn't know at the time that we were preparing for another big crisis, but a lot of exotic and new financial products were developing. The housing market was hot.
Yeah.
Okay, across the West anyway. So I started my career at Standard & Poor's, covering financial markets. I learned a lot. I had an Amex to take the clients, my contacts out for lunch, which was a lot of fun, as you can imagine. There were cocktails on all the time. We'd go to the pub at lunchtime. We'd go for long lunches. I mean, things that don't really happen anymore. And there was a kind of Wolf of Wall Street atmosphere, a lot of banter. It was pretty fierce and pretty crazy. I loved it. And it was a man's world, So you had to be able to stand up to the boys or become one of the boys in order to
right.
That was a lot of fun. So I did that for a while. Then I joined another company doing something very similar called AFX News. And then I joined Bloomberg. And there again, a big, step change, a big revelation, I guess, because I was meant to work as a producer for the French channel. And very quickly, in fact, after 2 weeks, I think I moved on to presenting on the French channel. Then the financial crisis happened. In the meantime, I had 2 babies. And I ended up working for the English channel, but that was a bit tougher, especially the 3 a.m. starts with 2 babies at home. So I left. I had to start my freelance career from scratch. And that was tough. So that's when I developed new skills, because at the time, sorry, it's a long story, isn't it, Christopher?
No,
Very
this is
much
great.
aware of
No,
it.
no, no.
But just to explain how I got to where I am today. At the time, I did a little bit of everything. I did the correspondence for a couple of French news channels and European channels here in London. I also did a lot of writing. At the time, there was a new type of marketing emerging called brand content, or paid content. And it was all about using journalistic skills to write authentic content that ultimately was sponsored by corporates. Okay. I did a lot of that. I did a lot of editorial strategy, a lot of writing. I had the occasional media training opportunity, etc. And then I started to work for a company regularly that provide coverage of small stocks, doing lots of interviews, recorded interviews, video interviews. And that's when we realized basically the communication channels in the 2010s started to really explode. So you had the internet, you had social media, etc. So there were many, many different ways to promote your work, do interviews, and share messages generally. So I did a lot of that. As I gained skills and confidence, I guess, I was asked to moderate, interviews or panels or MC conferences, and there we are. And now I spent a lot of time traveling the world to MC conferences in English and in French, and to moderate panels from Kazakhstan to Dubai, COP28, to Paris, to New York, Climate Week,
Yeah.
whatever, you name it. And I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
That's one thing I haven't said yet. I need to insist on that point. I absolutely love what I do. It's more than a passion. I basically stopped working a couple of years ago. It's become a lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple of things I picked up on there. I mean, you didn't say that you loved it until 30 seconds ago, but the point that we were just speaking about earlier, body communication and verbal, nonverbal, all those things were certainly indicated. I can see the passion was there, is there, and continues, it's probably going to continue on for quite some time. So that's one thing I observed, you breaking this all down for us. But then another thing too that struck me was that, if we were looking at your career on paper, it would look fairly linear in the sense that like people might get the impression like this was all cerebral and all planned out. And maybe perhaps it was. Perhaps a lot of those elements are there. But also at the same time, too, I'm getting that impression that you were metaphorically like walking through different doors. You weren't afraid to walk through, sometimes out of necessity. Like I think you've started off, you needed that job. But then after that, it was like, well, okay, maybe I'll try this out. Maybe I'll go in here and see what that's like. And then that leads on to a different opportunity. Is that kind of how things were evolving to a certain extent? Like you had this vision of where you'd like to go in your career, but you weren't afraid to, not to challenge things, I suppose, that maybe weren't within your wheelhouse.
I think that yet again, you've hit the nail on the head here, Christopher, because a few things that you mentioned. First of all, I've mentioned curiosity.
Yeah.
So I think it's important because obviously we're doing this to inspire people out there to find their calling, hopefully, because I hope they do, because it's the best thing in the world once you do find that thing that really gives you joy and it's your job, it pays your bills, it's even better, isn't it?
Right, right.
You never think it's to try things. I haven't mentioned a number of times I have failed, but there were many, and they were stinging and they were very hard. But every time it was a lesson. Remember there, failure is information. It's very important to remember that. And the other thing is courage.
Yeah.
It's courage. And recently, actually, I've discovered the key principles of teleology. For those who don't know it, it's the psychology of Alfred Adler. It's based on individual psychology, and it advocates treating every day like your first day almost, and not finding yourself excuses based on your past experiences, your trauma, your upbringing, your failures, not using labels that have been assigned to you, that you constantly assign to yourself. I'm shy. I'm not good with numbers. I'm not good with people. But in fact, like I've said, every moment, a sort of blank sheet, a white canvas where you think, oh, what am I going to do next? So I'd say yes, courage. And it's called often the psychology of courage, of just going for what excites you and forgetting about all this self-limitation stuff that is basically the biggest impediment to your success in life. It's not other people, it's not circumstances, it's you. You're your number one enemy, okay? Just, it's very important for people to be aware of that. I'll go back to it later on, but for me, I mean, late in my 30s, I started to realize that my lack of faith in myself was holding me back, okay? And once I started to not care so much what people think, that's when all the doors started to open. So I say, yes, it's a mix of being curious, being brave, trying new things. I cannot tell you the number of times I have been out of my comfort zone, and I still do. In fact, I'm constantly out of my comfort zone. I think it's very important for people to get out there, and you do not learn, you don't grow, and most of all, you don't overcome those self limitations if you don't get out of your comfort zone. And it's painful. It's painful, but you have to go through it. So there's that. That's about courage. And the third one is, you've mentioned vision. I think I've always had some vision. I've always wanted to be a journalist. The odds were really stacked against me. I mean, I grew up in a small village. I'm non-native. I wanted to make it in the Anglo-Saxon world. I'm a woman. It's okay now, but it's not always been very, very helpful, let's face it. I don't have connections. I'm not from a privileged background, so I didn't have all that. In fact, I realize now that it was a strength, not having to follow, certain codes or certain ways or expectations, I guess. So that's an important factor, this vision. I've always wanted to be a journalist. And from the moment I wanted to be a journalist, because I knew it was going to give me a lot of joy, I've tried my very best to become a journalist and to did it. And then even going for this job as a stock market reporter, even though it was a kind of backdoor way into the journalism I wanted to do, it was still journalism. I was still going to learn. And because journalism is not so much about knowledge, it's about process, how you tell a story, how you find an angle, okay, and why you should tell it. And I think that's the very important aspect of it. So it's a combination of those things. And right now, actually, over the past 5 years, maybe, I've had to develop a lot more intention in my professional development. And I have someone coaching me, and I've had someone coaching me for years. And this person, I will call her Florence, because she may listen to this broadcast one day. She's been very helpful in helping me understand what really drives me. People think, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that. And it's not the right question to ask yourself. The right question to ask yourself is, what gives me joy? What brings out all the passion in me that I could do, that I will end up doing well as a result of all the energy I put into it because I love it so much. That's the way to look at it.
Yeah, I love it. I love all these insights. I think they're incredibly helpful to any listener who's, again, aspiring to get into, say, journalism. But I think what you're sharing right now applies across so many different fields, across any industry, across any job, really. It's some of these core values or ways of reframing and interpreting the world that are really, helpful and, beneficial to those who actually take them on and actually start to adopt some of these strategies, essentially. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I do have another segment that I would like to step into here, a day in the life. And again, getting back to some of the services that you offer, you have this wide range of things that you're involved in, from moderation to these interviews with French ministers to, politicians to high-ranking CEOs, listed companies, unlisted companies, a lot of different types of individuals. So I'd be curious here about what it's like leading up to one of these events. For example, for somebody who doesn't know, obviously there's going to be a lot of preparation that goes into this, but maybe you could shed a little bit more light on all of this and what you go through when you are, prepping for something like that.
Okay, so I think the approach is different whether you work for traditional media when you're doing this, or you're working for an organization, an institution, a corporate, let's say, or a conference, because the objectives are different. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what I do within the context of doing it for a conference sponsored by an institution or a corporate. I will tell you why it's different afterwards. First of all, with the organizers, you need to define their expectations and objectives. Why did they invite this person? Why did they organize this panel? What is it for? I think it's important to get the big picture to start with. What is it all about? I give you an example, for instance, of a conference where I interviewed lately. Let's say I travel to Saudi Arabia and it was a conference on global labor markets. There was a panel with specialists of AI and how AI is going to change the world of work, which is very topical these days. So first, I talked to the organizers. Why did you want to talk about it? Why is it important? So it's important for the world generally, but it's important for Saudi Arabia as well, because all the content will help them feed their own reflection on how they should, steer their strategy in the right direction to provide a job market that will cater for the need to use AI more often in our daily lives. So first, you talk to the organizers. You try to understand what they're trying to achieve, what their vision is, okay? Then when you have to moderate a panel with experts, I always try to talk to each participant individually, and I ask them in light of the theme, because you don't start from nowhere. You normally have a theme for a discussion. And if you're very lucky, the organizers will give you a few bullet points in terms of the different aspects they want you to touch upon. And you will discuss them with the participants, I always ask them, what do you want people to remember after you have spoken? Okay. Quite often we don't approach it the right way. And I ask people, engage them to think about, what people should remember. It's the best way ever. And that's valuable for people out there as well. Think about what people should remember.
What their message is, right? What they're trying to get across,
Yeah.
what they're trying to have, resonate with people, intellectually speaking,
Totally.
or emotionally speaking, perhaps.
Absolutely. But I think it's very important because I often also ask them how people should feel. And that's another aspect of communication that people often neglect. Okay. And another thing that people should understand is that people will remember emotions more than they will remember facts and data. Okay. That's why for me, it's important to create a positive, uplifting communication experience. There's no point sharing lots of data and facts about an important topic if people leave feeling depleted or depressed or confused. No, that's pointless. You have failed in that sense, okay? So then I talk to the participants. I do ask them what their key messages are, starting the other way around, like I mentioned. And then based on what they've all said, I will try to craft to create a narrative because it's got to flow. So I will almost treat the panel like a story or like an article. Okay, that's how I do it. The journalist's way, I guess. I'm often thinking in terms of, I'm thinking in headlines. Headlines, header, text, the big information. I mean, how would you tell that story? So that's what I'm trying to do. And unfortunately, sometimes you don't have much time to prepare. So I always advise people, and it doesn't matter because it's not about you as a person, as a journalist, okay? It's about, like I've said, it's about what your clients want. It's about the audience, the public, the participants, etc. But they have to have that visibility, that comfort, that you know what you're doing. But if you don't have the time to do that, like I've said, keep it general. Ask the big questions to give them as much space as they need to deliver that message. Yeah.
I like that. I mean, it sounds to me like you're almost like reverse engineering it all in a way. Like you have your objectives and you're trying to understand the context again of what the organizers are getting after, what they want. And then also too, like what these individuals want to get across. What is their key messaging? How do they want people to feel? And you being that moderator or person who's bringing it all together. And I like that metaphor of it being a story or being a headline, a heading, and like, yeah, I think that's really helpful.
That's very helpful because it really then helps you create all sorts of follow-ups or questions where people have the chance to deliver something powerful, like a powerful soundbite, etc. If you think that way. But I just wanted to go back to what you have just said. This reverse engineering, I find it really interesting, and I think that's quite the appropriate term indeed. It's important to prepare. It looks unprepared, but it's always very prepared, isn't it? You must also leave enough room for the unexpected, an interaction with the audience. It's happened to me to basically literally, break panels to go, I can see you smiling over there. Obviously that's making you react. You want to share something with us. That really adds generally to like I've said, to the experience and to the panel, because it's not about, there is not this invisible, well, there is a sort of invisible curtain between you and the audience, but it should not be like that. It's not about talking at people, but to people. Otherwise, what's the point? It's a dialogue. It's not a presentation or a lecture. It's not a passive process.
Yeah, it's for the audience, right? At the end of the day, I mean, that's like obviously physically the people that are there, but then also like more broadly speaking, what that message is going to filter out beyond the walls of that room when it's taking place, right? Like that's what you want it to, that's the goal. I would say that's the objective. So keeping that first and foremost, planted within your mind would have to be, a central sort of theme to all of this, right?
And I think the point you've made is this reverse engineering. I mean, that I would call it being on message.
Okay.
Okay. Really understanding what the objectives are, let's say, and sticking to that and always, going back to it. I think that's very, very important because it gives structure to the overall panel or communication opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do have this other question here as well that I'd like to ask. And this one relates to some of the trainings that you do with, top CEOs or others who are interested in your services. Again, in speaking with so many different professionals on this program, not too long ago, I had a PR expert on, and he was speaking about an interaction he had back in the day. He's a veteran of the industry based within America, and he was actually mentored by the late Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger had told him that the ideal situation when you're answering a question, of course, is to do your best in answering it, but immediately bridge to your message. And this is something we were just speaking about earlier. And that was a message that stuck with my guest, and it kind of guided his entire career in terms of PR. Now, the question I'm driving at here with you is, do you have like your core beliefs or teachings that you go about with every single person that you're working with? Like this is central to, being a good communicator. This is something you cannot forget. You have to try to do this each and every time. Do you have any sort of like core messaging that you're relaying or teaching to some of your clients?
Very much so. First of all, I advise people not to take questions or things too personally. If the interviewer becomes a little bit pressing or aggressive, no one's putting a gun to your head. You don't have to reply straight away. Take a deep breath, take your time and think. And going back to the point you've made, the technique you've just mentioned, there's a name for it. It's called pivoting. Okay, pivoting back to your message. Always. Remember, when you communicate, you are on a mission. Okay, and your mission is to share your message. Your mission is to make sure that when the people exit the room, they will remember a few key points about what you need to share. Okay. So that's something you need to bear in mind all the time. This is not just a random, moment to talk about various things. No, you are on a mission. And it's actually very helpful as well to get rid of nerves when you realize that you have a job to do. It's not about you.
That's a good point.
All you need to do is to deliver your message. Okay. So yes, when someone is asking you a question, eyes on the ball, what do I need to say? What's important? What do I need to go back to in terms of my messaging? You don't have to repeat the same thing all the time, but also another important aspect of communication is repetition. Repeat, repeat, repeat. People need to hear something at least 3 times to, vaguely remember it. So that's a very important point. Don't use the same words every time, but when it comes to messaging, say the same thing using different words, many times, and then eventually people will retain something. That's a very important point. So going back to the basics, actually, we've talked about preparation. We've talked about, messaging. First of all, you need to be you need to understand what your message is. Of course, there's no impactful or effective communication without that. Okay. So your messaging, what is it? You need to be very, very clear about it. Then how you communicate it, of course, by constantly pivoting back to it. And often a question, and I think it may have been, was it Kissinger or was it Reagan actually, who had this very, very famous quote. He said, or he would say after press interviews, do you have any questions for my answers?
This was Kissinger, because this was the story that was related to me, was this. It was about that. Yeah, it was Kissinger.
And it's such a brilliant quote. I always share with people when I give media training. Yeah. It's not about the questions. You can ignore them. You have to be subtle about it. There's an art to it. And the art is to acknowledge the question.
Yeah.
Yeah. I understand why you're asking that. And then bridge to something else. So pivot back to your messaging. but I'm here to tell you that this and that. Okay. So that's called pivoting. And it's super important. And you see politicians doing it all
All
the
the
time because,
time.
of
Yeah.
course, they're always trying to, veer away from the difficult questions. Another advice I would say is to keep it short and simple. Don't just go on about things you don't need to. Make your point, say what you have to say, shoot and leave, right? What else could I share in terms of good tips for effective communication? Yeah, think of a few powerful quotes that you could share in advance of the interview, for instance. I mean, I could go on about it all day.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Well, I think those are helpful.
It's very,
Yeah.
media training, empowering people to be better communicators is so rewarding. I love doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see why. I mean, like you would be able to see the results, right? Like pretty quickly, like when people are adopting some of these values or strategies and approaches. Yeah, absolutely. For sure. I could see the value in all of that. And how you as a professional could be deriving a sense of fulfillment from all of that. But I do have another question here. I'm just throwing them at you. But this one here is centered on something, when I was researching you, that you noted as being an important part of being a professional, and which has led to a lot of your success. And it was this notion of being a socio-culturally agile professional. And I'm not so sure that a young person would exactly know what you're driving at there. So maybe you could break that down and then also maybe relay how that's played a role in your career in attaining certain levels of success along the way.
I think it's important for people to realize, and maybe that's what maturity gives you, because it's a kind of gift. It's important to realize that all the attributes about you, or the given, let's say, that you thought were impediments, are normally your greatest strengths. Okay. I used to have a chip on my shoulder about my French accent, for instance, when moderating. No, I mean, there's space for it now. It's absolutely okay. As long as you're clear enough, it's cool. I used to think it was hard to succeed in the world of financial journalism as a woman. Absolutely not. Okay. And in fact, I'm very much aware now that I get more opportunities to moderate and present because I can do it in a man's world, because there are so many manuals and people are sick of it. They want a different type. It's not just for, diversity for the sake of diversity, but people with a different background will give you a different vibe, a different emotional range. They will give you a different perspective. Okay. They will add value. So yes, I'm going back to it. What did I say? I can't even remember what I said. It was
Socio-culturally agile professional.
culturally agile.
Yeah.
I'm a lower middle class kid. Okay. And same, I used to have some, what's the best way to describe it? I used to be slightly ashamed of it, to be honest. That I didn't have the family culture, support, and guidance that so many of my subsequent, friends and colleagues had. But there again, and like I've said, my parents were not particularly helpful, unfortunately, in terms of finding my calling. But there was a great degree of freedom. And that freedom let me, I had the freedom to do whatever I wanted to do. And that was very empowering too. So all these things, being the latchkey kid, growing up in a small village in Brittany, having no connections whatsoever, no clue about how you're supposed to behave, hold yourself, no one's telling you what to say, what not to say, whatever. All that freedom gave me so much power, because I was able, first of all, it made me extremely resilient. I've always been extremely independent. I've never literally counted on anyone in life for my professional development anyway, and for most things, let's face it. So it's made me very resilient. It's made me possibly more authentic, because when no one's telling you how to be, or when there are no expectations, you can just be yourself. I think people find it refreshing. I certainly have a very different view on life, and even when I'm having those conversations, I know that I'm not to say that I'm contrarian, but I know that will bring in a different perspective. And normally it's the big picture. Why are we doing this? What's the point? When the problem with people who've been very institutionalized, they don't realize that what they're doing is always following the same pattern. So my message for the people listening to us right now is to realize that your insecurities about who you are should be embraced. They make you you. You are unique. Everyone is. There's no one else like you. So there's something about you that is special, that is different. There's something wonderful about you, and you need to embrace that and be out there and go for it. And don't care what people, who cares what people think, quite frankly. It doesn't really matter. You can't spend your entire life expecting validation from other people. Although, I mean, I'm a presenter. I very much understand that I have a need for validation, for being seen. It's probably because I didn't get much of that when I grew up. It took me a while to get that. And now I love it. And now I want to share it. I want to tell people that, you can follow your dream, because I've mentioned loving my career earlier, but Christopher, really, I mean, I live the life of my dreams.
Yeah, I love that. I love that sentiment right there. And, it really comes down to this reframe. And I think, like, again, in speaking with so many different types of people on this program, this is a common theme that comes up. People that are achieving success, that are finding it, have this almost superpower. I wouldn't say that they're born with it, but maybe through experience or through life experiences along the way, they've learned, and it sounds like for you too, learned how to reframe situations or experiences that could have been interpreted as, quite negative, or things that would have really derailed you. And I think that's what does happen, unfortunately, to some people is, they go through some very adverse situations or experience some things that, are tough to get through, and they let that, in a way, beat them, right? But it sounds like to me that the way you've kind of looked at it all, it's like, no, this is empowering to me. This gives me a different, angle to pursue things. This gives me a different perspective, that is valuable, that is wanted. And I think that fine line right there can really spell the difference between, ultimate career success or even, life success for that matter. Like, careers and lives are certainly intertwined. So yeah, I really like that. I like that point there.
And I think it's resilience, Christopher. Like I've said, I've failed many times in life. I haven't been up to the job many times in life. I've not always been great. I'm not always great. Not to say I'm great, but I think I do my job well enough. I think
your resume speaks for itself. You've done some pretty fabulous things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's about recognizing, and that's not arrogant, what you're good at eventually in life. Okay, it's very, very important. But going back to the point we were making earlier, it's important to embrace failure and to learn from it, but to learn it and not use it as a reason not to either persevere or to shut down. And no, it's like I've said earlier, it's information. Okay, I screwed up. Right. So next time I will be better prepared. Next time I will research more. Next time I will follow my intuition. This was not for me. Okay. Every time. I think that's, success. I think successful people comes from various things, but two things. It's having that fire. And normally that fire comes from a place of discomfort and pain. Okay. And often it's to do with difficult childhood experiences or early adulthood experiences, or maybe a trauma, something major that's happened in your life. I've noticed some of the most driven people out there had, big traumatic problems that they were still dealing with. Okay, but it's given them that fire. Okay, and that fire has to be embraced. It's energy. Energy is great. Zero energy is death. It's horrible. It's awful. So there's that. And there's this capacity to bounce back, to use the failures, like I've said, to grow. I think that's key, and it's super important. And you're right that when you're faced with a situation, and that's been a journey, a process for me, I've not always been very good at it. I'm not always very good at it. But now I will consciously think, this is not an ideal situation, but surely I can turn it to my advantage somehow. How? And sometimes I will sit down, literally, and do some mind mapping. Mind mapping is when you write a word and, you explore different connections, etc. So I will sit down, or I will draw a line, pros, cons, whatever. And now, because sometimes you need to analyze all those experiences and make a decision based on them. But don't just sit there and take it and wallow in self-pity. Don't do that. It's what good is it?
Exactly. I love that. I think it's so helpful for listeners. I do have one last segment that I would like to slide in here. And it's a crystal ball segment. As the name implies, we're looking towards the future, trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And kind of returning back to, the world or the sphere that you're operating within. You're speaking with leaders, interviewing individuals, broadcast journalism, all of that. I find right now is a really interesting time, in that space. Obviously, you still have traditional media, print, broadcast. It's still there. It's not as dominant as it once was, obviously. Now we have social media that certainly entered into the fray, not too long ago, and it's having an impact. And then to layer all of that with AI, that's, shifting and changing things around. It's just a truly, interesting time to be studying all of this. So the question I'm driving at here is, like, from your perspective as a professional within this space, what's your feeling or your intuition of where things are going or could be going?
A few things here. First of all, personally, I believe that traditional media is dying out and can only survive like it's done over the past year through a subscription model and a premiumization of quality journalism, because that's what's happened. But we're going even beyond that now. There's a premiumization of the truth, because I think the greatest danger, and anyone can become a journalist, okay? And that's what's changed tremendously over the past 10, 15 years. Now we've got all those digital communication channels. Anyone can tell their story or share their view of a historical event unfolding live on Instagram or TikTok or whatever.
Or a podcast, like the rise of podcasts as well, right?
Or
like
podcast.
This. Yeah.
Although podcast is different, because to me, a podcast is a different way of consuming information. It's part of this slow tech movement where people take their time to analyze things. But yeah, a podcast is for a niche audience. So this fragmentation is leading to a fragmentation of the audience itself. But the result is you've got all those pockets of communication channels for different communities. And the danger is that they don't really meet.
Well, I think that's what's happening right now, right? I mean, in a way.
It's absolutely happening right now. And I think that that's a shame, although it's quite nice to be part of, your community, for instance, because I think we're on the same page here. So you need to find your communication tribe almost, but you need to also try to make sure you challenge yourself enough by looking at what others are doing as well. So I'm a mother. I've got 3 children, including teenage boys. As you can imagine, they spend a lot of time on TikTok. And I used to rubbish TikTok as a source of, basically, was the right way to describe it, of mindless and fairly empty, shallow, memes and information. But there's more to it. And what's dangerous is the fact that TikTok can also be used as an instrument to influence, okay? So I think the biggest challenge over the next few years is going to be conserving truth, conserving a space, a platform for truth and truthful journalism and storytelling. But at the same time, this concept is a little bit complex.
Yeah, to say the least.
And paradoxical, because what is the truth anyway?
Right. Like okay. that's always the argument,
What is, and that's why in a way I quite like the fact that you've got different sources of truth, The truth is to be delivered, take no offense, Christopher, but by middle class or upper class, educated white males on the BBC and CNN, etc. And that was also one vision of the world, but there are many different visions of the world. And recently I enjoyed moderating conversations at the Global Media Congress in Abu Dhabi. And there was actually a discussion about AI. And it was interesting because obviously what we know now is that we're going to need to use AI to fight AI. So we're going to need AI to spot fake AI, I don't know, crafted, if you wish, misinformation. We're going to need that. Okay, so that's the first point. The second, yes, truth will come at a premium, whatever truth is. AI is great because it's very helpful to reach out to smaller linguistic communities, for instance, in Africa, but there are so many, many different languages being spoken and people actually don't have access to the news or information because of that. But it's also empowering people in Africa, for instance, to tell their own story, their own way, and to have their own narrative. Because let's face it, we've been fairly colonialist in the way we've been, sharing the truth or journalism or events or news generally. So I wouldn't say I'm an optimist. I'm quite realistic, but like I've said, because I'm very opportunistic, I guess. Well, I'm not that opportunistic, but I like to think that in all of this, we're going to find ways to make the world hopefully a better place. And there's obviously real suffering and pain and conflict going on. But sadly, that's the story of humanity. And in the West generally, where you are based in Japan and here in Western Europe, if you look at the long-term development trends, something that journalists don't talk about on the news, they are overall positive. We're beating cancer. We're beating HIV. We're living longer and longer. We are going to hopefully develop amazing technologies that will help us fight disease, that maybe will enable us to accelerate the development of clean tech so we can fight climate change better. So there's a lot of good stuff happening out there, as well as the bad.
Certainly, certainly. Well, I can't believe we are approaching this hour mark in the conversation, but I am respectful of your time. And like I said, it's been a true pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I know listeners are really going to appreciate all the insights that you shared today. So thanks so much, Charlotte, for joining the program.
Am I allowed a very last message to your
Absolutely.
audience?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Since this podcast is about inspiring people to find a job, a career they love, my job, what I do, like I've said, it's not a job anymore. It's a lifestyle. My occupation, let's call it, has been one of the greatest source of joy and pleasure in my life. It has been a journey. It's not always been the case. But it's important to have, we talked about the vision earlier, maybe not that vision, maybe not that fire, but to have that desire, that energy to keep going until you find that very spot. And I like to end on those words.
Perfect way, I'd say. Thanks so much, Charlotte.
My pleasure, Christopher.
Now, for those interested in learning more about Charlotte and her work, you can do so via LinkedIn. You can also check out her portfolio website, charlottecon.me. She's also on YouTube, Instagram, and X. And just for reference, I will have links for all of those within the show notes. And hey, if you like today's show, please be sure to tell a friend and share. To show further support, you can always rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. As I mentioned off the top, head on over to YouTube. I do have that channel over there, Life as a ... which hosts highlights from these audio conversations. And if you do get over there, I would love that like or subscribe. Now, finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as a, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.